Alright, so next up we have me. My name is John Humphreys. I run the Australian Libertarian Society. So in some fashion or manner I've dragged you all here today and tomorrow. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk to you... one person had a good time. I'm going to talk to you about a missing market in whales and sharks. And I don't mean whales the country, I mean whales the animal. Again, I said at the beginning, often people correctly identify a problem and it's just the solution they talk about that we have a problem with. And there is a problem with the overfishing of whales and sharks. Not so much whales anymore because there's 1,001 groups already going around trying to save the whales. But with sharks, because they're not quite as cute and cuddly and occasionally they bite people, no one's really tried to protect the sharks so far. And I'm not suggesting setting up a big body to protect them, but in some places 90% of sharks are being killed off, and there's potential big consequences of this for the underwater ecology. And even if there wasn't, as an avid scuba diver, I want there to be sharks. I want to go and find the sharks, and I'm not the only one. So sharks have been dying off, and if you don't want them to, then if you don't want a government solution, there needs to be a market solution. So the obvious solution to my mind is we need to privatise the whales and sharks. So, now, what we have here is a typical issue of the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is sometimes wrongly referred to as a public good. It's not a public good. Tragedy of the commons is when you have a situation that is rivalrous but non-excludable. Now, a public good is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. But if it's rivalrous and non-excludable, we have a public resource good. And the problem here is you can't exclude people so everyone can use it, but it's rivalrous, so when you use it, other people can't. And this obviously leads to overuse. It's the standard tragedy of the commons. I'm sure many of you are already aware of it. Now, there is a very obvious solution to the tragedy of the commons, and that is take something that's not excludable and make it excludable. And you do that by allocating strict property rights over it. So we've come into this problem in many situations, and we've solved it in many situations. There's a really good example with animals on land, where it's a little bit easier to find them and cage them and follow where they're going. Elephants in Africa. For a long time, many countries in Africa were having problems with elephants being overhunted, overpoached. Now, the official rule was nobody owns the elephants. Right? We all own the elephants. They're collective goods. And no one should kill them. But of course, writing a law doesn't make people follow a law. There was no one with a real incentive to protect the elephants. There was a lot of poaching. Elephants were moving towards being endangered. Now, the solution that has worked the best... The solution that's worked the best with this was done in Zimbabwe. I know today you think Zimbabwe, you think crackpot dictator and $1 trillion note. But before the country went insane, they introduced an idea which basically amounts to privatising the elephants. They gave ownership of the elephants to the local communities, the local groups that the elephants were near. And they said, you now have the right to sell these elephants to people who want to come and kill them. People who want to go and hunt an elephant. Now, it sounds instinctively like a bad thing if you want to protect the elephants. What happened, as soon as they allowed people to own and sell and shoot the elephants, people had an incentive to protect the elephants, to breed them up, and it got to the point where Zimbabwe ended up with almost a plague of elephants. They started exporting them. Because when people have an incentive to protect something, they start protecting it. So this is the standard solution to a tragedy of the commons. Create fixed property rights, create understood property rights, and then you can create excludability. It stops being a common resource good, starts becoming a private good. Now the problem with whales and sharks is they're migratory. If you had fish in one area that stayed in one area, you could just privatise that little area of water and you could solve that problem. And that's true for some sharks as well, so that would solve that problem. But for a lot of sharks and for whales, they're migratory. Often they never go to the same place twice. And at the moment, there's no viable way to privatise the entire ocean. So there's a potential way we can try to think innovatively. We need a solution to this. We need to suggest a solution that isn't just create a new UN body. We need a solution where people actually want to have incentives to try and protect the enforcement of the property rights they have over the sharks and whales. So what I've suggested is, in most instances where whales and sharks are in demand, if you want to eat them, if you want to look at them underwater, if you just care about the ecology, they're fungible. Which means it's no particular shark you care about. It's not a shark called Lucy that you're worried about. It's just the sharks, right? So they're fungible. And if they're fungible, what we could do is instead of having ownership of specific sharks and whales, we could have ownership of a fixed percentage of the amount of sharks and whales that exist. So This is a slight twist on the normal idea of property rights, but since the importance of these animals is fungible, I think it can work. So what you do is, we're getting to the point where we have the technology of knowing how many sharks and whales exist anywhere at any point in time, and we can get the groups together that have an interest in the whales and sharks, and we can work out an allocation of property rights over a percentage of the sharks and whales that exist. Now, being a libertarian, my first instinct is we need to have them homestead these sharks and whales in some sensible way. Well, again, if you're trying to do it individually for sharks and whales, that's not going to work. But if you accept my suggestion that they're fungible, then there is a way you can understand sharks and whales having been homesteaded, and that is, or at least a percentage of the continued existence of sharks and whales being homesteaded, and that is that there are lots of people who are out there currently mixing their labour with finding and using sharks and whales to various degrees. People who take scuba dive tours underwater to go and see sharks and whales, they're mixing their labour and they're making use of them. People who kill the sharks and whales make shark fin soup, which apparently just tastes like water anyway, but they're mixing their labour. So there are groups out there that are already doing things that you could consider the equivalent of homesteading a percentage of sharks and whales if you accept that they're fungible. So what we could do is we can get these people together that have various different uses. I mean, of course they hate each other. The people who want to eat the sharks aren't the same as the ones who want to look at the sharks. But they both have an interest in... Sorry? No. Okay. They both have an interest in sharks existing, and they both want to have access to the sharks. So if we can work out a way to allocate, according to looking at the previous rules of use of sharks and whales, allocate ownership of a percentage of the sharks and whales that exist, then we can create a system where people can start only using their own sharks and whales. Now, of course, if you have a percentage of sharks and you just say there's 100 sharks and you have 10% and you kill 10 sharks that year, the next year you don't own any more sharks. Right now there's 90 sharks left, but they all belong to the other people. So there's now an incentive for the people who want to eat the sharks, or shark fin soup, to actually breed up the numbers as well. So there's going to be incentives to protect, just like in Zimbabwe with the elephants. Even the people who want to kill the animal are starting to have incentives to protect or to breed up or increase the number in the species. And obviously the people who want to stare at the animals want to breed up the number as well, and they don't want to kill them. So this is the idea of potentially introducing property rights on sharks and whales, tradable property rights on sharks and whales, and hopefully recreating the incentives that we need to be able to protect any part of the environment we care about. So that's the end of that idea. Thank you very much.